What we want to talk about is the value of asking what I call the big questions. We want to have a questioning faith, and we want to clarify that, make sure we're clear on that, and see that when we have a struggle, when we have doubts, this isn't a bad thing necessarily, and how should we handle those things? How should we lean in order to find truth? So that's what we're about this evening. So I a long time ago, it feels like, at least, I was sitting in a seminary classroom. I was training for ministry. It's at least supposed to be, right? But I found myself doubting my faith. I really wasn't sure if Christianity was true. Sort of all of a sudden, it sort of came crashing in on me. And to understand the significance of that, you need to know a little bit about my background. So I grew up in a very, very Christian home. Very, very Christian home. My folks were in the ministry. It was a ministry that was started by my great great grandfather. In fact, it was a ministry for addiction recovery, and that's where I grew up just as a kid. And um, we were the sort that were, if the church doors were open, we were there. So I got the full force of everything that the church had to offer, from Sunday school, right, every week, youth group, children's ministry, youth retreats, camps, even did international mission trips. I did Bible college and then went to seminary, and I realized there, sitting in the seminary classroom, that I had never asked a very, very important question. And that question is this true? Is Christianity actually true? And for the very first time, and I'm talking this, 20, I was in my 20s, um, wondered if Christianity was actually true. And I'm sure I had asked questions along the way, but what was different was that I was open for the first time in my life for Christianity to possibly be false. Right? There's one way to ask questions, and we do this as Christians a lot, where we're asking questions, but we're really not open to the possibility of it's being false. We're just sort of sitting around asking questions. So I'm going to leave you there in the story. I'll come back to it in a little bit, but there's some big movements going on in the world related to Christian faith. So there's a great new book out. I mean, it's focused, I think, almost exclusively on the States, so it might not be as relevant for you all. But it's called The Great De-Churching, and what they've done over a very large and very expensive sociological study is they've tracked how many people have left the church. And what has happened, what they have found, is that 40 million Americans who were once, to some degree faithful to church, have stepped out of going to church and now go less than one time a year. 40 million. And that started in the mid 1990s. Things like the advent of the internet, and just kind of becoming aware of other views and having access to communities of people who think differently, has caused a lot of folks to just step out of church for one reason or another. And the other statistic that I have is that this is from a George Barna study. If you're familiar with that group, they do a lot of studies for ministry, again, probably mostly focused on the States, but they have it at 2/3 of our Christian youth are walking away from the church. This is, I was going to say it's a steady rate. It's actually increased. So when they did the study, I think in 2011 originally, and it was around 59% were walking away. Now they've got it at 64%, and that's a few years old. So it could be even higher today, but it's roughly 2/3 of our Christian youth. Right, so these are kids that grow up in the church, typically get to college, into their college years, and they step out of the church. Now, it's not to say that all of these folks walk away from Christianity necessarily. Sometimes they just don't want it to have anything to do with the so-called organized religion or the institution of the church, and yet they may keep their Christian faith to some degree intact and that kind of a thing. But what we've seen is a major exit. But you're probably wondering, why are we in New Zealand talking about what's going on in the U.S.? Well, I looked up and looked at the studies for New Zealand, and we're seeing a similar thing here, as you probably know. So in 2006, the census had it at 49% of New Zealanders, of Kiwis, will identify as Christian. 49%, so close to half. And to 2023, it's dropped to one third, roughly one third, will identify as Christians, right? It's the same kind of de-churching and people walking away from the church, walking away from their Christian faith to some degree or other. Now, where have they gone? Well, you actually have almost a mirror image increase in people in New Zealand who would identify as no religion, or what I usually call a none, None, no religion at all. So that in 2006 was 35, and in 2023 has it as over half. So over half of New Zealand, half of Kiwis will identify as no religion. So it's this great secularization, in a way, of the Western world. I mean, there are parts of the world that are growing in terms of the church, but what we're seeing, a lot of our places in which the church is pretty prominent is a secularization. People walking away. Now, I care a lot about New Zealand, and I care a lot about the States, but there's certain a few individuals that I care about the most when I look at these statistics. So here's our crew here, our 4 kids. Yes, they are all home. They're teenagers, so they're kind of on their own. Our Sherry sisters down the street, but anyway, I worry about these statistics because I worry about these 4 ones, right? Because I can do a little math, and if 64% of the youth are walking away, that's going to make me pretty nervous, pretty concerned. And we want to do this. We want to ask why. Why is it happening that so many folks are walking away from the church? Like, what is it in the church that's causing so many folks to walk away? Now, what I want to caution us towards is to not oversimplify. I think any big sociological move, especially that's in different countries across the world, is going to be complex, and we can't boil it down to just, we just need to teach more apologetics, then we'll be good. Like, we won't have people walking away. But I think that I'm convinced that part of the reason is that the church is just not always a safe place to doubt and deeply question faith. Right? We're not inviting questions. I got through all the way into my 20s through Bible college and everything the church had to offer, even into seminary, and I was never prompted to really deeply question my faith, to really ask why. And again, I think sometimes people will find themselves in a place of doubt, and so, right, they're not going to do that in the church. That's a problem if they're in a place of doubt for the church. And I think that is a big problem that we want to talk about. So my claims for us tonight, I've got 2. The first is that asking questions, I want to say, is a crucial part of Christian discipleship. I think that those who don't have any questions, I'm a little nervous for them in their faith. I've got lots of questions, right? I've got a lot of things figured out since those seminary days, but I've got a significant number of questions that I'm still thinking about, that I'm still working on, and I think that's just what it is to be a disciple of the Lord Jesus, is to be asking questions and pursuing truth in that way. So that's the first claim for us tonight. And then the second thing is just to say doubts are a normal part of the journey. They're a normal part of asking, again, what I call the deep and difficult questions and struggling through those a little bit. That's just going to be part of the journey, and that's completely fine. In fact, I think that when we find ourselves in a place of doubt, it's actually a wonderful opportunity to find great value in those doubts. And that's what I want to recast. That's kind of my mission, is to recast the idea of doubt for us, so that we just think more in a more healthy way about doubts, and hopefully can lead others in the same sort of way. So let me make good on these claims. So the first claim is that our questions are just crucial to discipleship. There's a story of Jesus's life that's really unique in some ways. It only shows up in one gospel, and it's the only story about Jesus in his adolescence. Right? We've got a number of the infancy, so-called infancy narratives. But Luke chapter 2, which a lot of us read Luke chapter 2 on Christmas and talk about, the infancy narrative there. But the second half of Luke chapter 2 has a little snapshot story of Jesus as a 12-year-old. Right. And I've got so I have a 12-year-old about to be 13, our youngest, our son. Right. And so the story, you might be familiar with it. So Jesus's family comes up to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. They stay the entire time, which shows that they are quite devout in their Jewish practice and so on. And so they start heading back to Nazareth, thinking that 12-year-old Jesus is with them, right? But come to find out he's not. And so they search for 3 days. And in Luke chapter 2, verses 46 through 47 says, after 3 days, right? I imagine it as a pretty frantic search for 12-year-old Jesus. After 3 days, where do they find him? Now, getting lost, not being where you're supposed to be, that's pretty typical 12-year-old behavior. Again, saying that as having 12-year-old. So, but where they find Jesus is pretty atypical for a 12-year-old behavior. They find him in the temple, sitting among the teachers. These would be the religious elites of the day, the scholars. And what's Jesus doing? He's listening to them. Anybody know 12-year-olds that listen super well? Right? He's listening to them, asking them questions. And all those who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. Now notice Jesus's posture here. He's in the posture of a learner. He's in the posture of a questioner, in a way, of a critical thinker, where he's listening, he's learning, but he's also engaging. He's asking questions and showing, right, that he's got the understanding that was astounding to them in some ways. Now, if you think, well, is that really the force of this passage? Is that what this passage is trying to say? I think it really truly is, because what you actually have that bookends this passage are two statements about Jesus's wisdom. Again, as an adolescent, it says that Jesus was growing in wisdom. Now, there's big theological questions here. What does it mean for the divine Son of God, even as a 12-year-old, to be growing in wisdom? But this passage seems to be designed, in a sense, to answer that question. Here's what it looks like. It's Jesus is going to be asking questions and learning and growing in his wisdom, whatever that means, right? Theologically, however we work that out. So the point for us, this kind of blew my mind, is that this is 12-year-old Jesus. So of course, if 12-year-old Jesus needs to be asking questions in order to grow, so should we. So should we. That should mark our growth as a Christian. Our discipleship as a Christian should be one of asking questions and pursuing the truth. Another way to kind of get at this is that Jesus is presented to us throughout the Gospels as a rabbi. Now, the term, again, might be familiar to us, but what was a rabbi? A rabbi was a kind of itinerant preacher who would travel around to different towns and give Bible lessons and theology lessons, even maybe some philosophy lessons. Maybe I'm just making that up. I'm not sure. But as a philosophy professor, I'd like for that to be true. But anyway, right, he's going to go around teaching the people. Now, the people get the rabbi in a moment, probably not unlike what we're doing right now, but the rabbis always had disciples. right? And what the disciples would get is they would get to have their meals with the rabbi. They would get to walk along the road with the rabbi. They would get all this extra time. And what a disciple or an apprentice is meant to be doing is asking questions. Why? Because they are rabbis in training. They are trying to be like the rabbi. And so they would ask questions. They would sort of press the rabbi, and you said this in the lesson, but what does this mean? And how do you connect it to that? I think that's a pretty beautiful picture of how we're meant to be as Christ's disciples. We're meant to be asking questions in order to grow. That's a crucial part of our discipleship. All right, well, how about doubts, right? Because doubts come in, my second claim that doubts are a normal part of the process. What I got to do first, this is, sorry, philosophy professor. I can't not like define some things. So I got to define what doubt is. That's just deep in me. Sorry. But anyway, what I think doubt is the struggle that we experience when we ask the big questions. It's just the tension, this intellectual tension. You might be wondering why there's a flying saucer with the tractor beam on the screen, right? Remember the old sci-fi movies where the tractor beam can kind of suck people in? If you get in the tractor beam, it's not going to be a good thing. Well, doubts are kind of like that, where they have a draw, they have a force on us, where we're just going along our merry way, maybe reading or listening to something or talking to someone, and someone raises an objection. And all of a sudden, we feel that draw. We kind of feel it kind of hurts a little, kind of is unpleasant in some ways. So I think what doubting is when something contrary to your beliefs sort of draws you in or kind of bothers you in that kind of a way. And another way to kind of put it is to say that what a doubt is, and as I put it in the book, is that it's when it seems as if one of your beliefs might be false, right? And haven't we been there with most of our beliefs at some point or other? It could be our political beliefs. It could, I mean, I think our, right? Anybody else feel like I don't even know what to believe today about politics? But anyway, uh, theology, the Bible, you know, it's just where you start to wonder, is this really true? And it seems there's the pull on you that it seems like it might be false, right? Again, not a particularly pleasant experience. Now, what is the value of doubt? Well, the very first thing that I always want to say to groups when I get to talk to them, especially when I'm talking to youth groups or high school groups or even younger, is that if you doubt, you are normal. Um, right? And I want to welcome that. I want my students, I want my own kids. Now, do I want them doubting? I don't want them doubting just because that's an unpleasant experience, but I do want them leaning in. And I think doubt is part of a normal part of that process. So I just want to say to people that when I talk that, look, if you experience doubts from time to time, I just want you to know you're normal. That's a normal part of the process. In fact, if you doubt, then you very well may be more honest than some of your peers, right? Who are just going along their merry way, never bothered by anything. And I say that only because someone who doubts is often that person who's willing, right, to ask the questions, to be curious, to lean in and pursue these things. And so I think well done in some ways if you're in a place of doubt. But doubt is not the goal. Doubt is not the destination. Doubt is not where we want to end up. There's way too many online personalities that are in a way celebrating doubt. And I don't want to celebrate. I would think it's a terrible experience in some ways. It's kind of like push-ups, right? Now we got some guys doing some push-ups here. I don't know what we said, if you can see this. Okay. I'm not sure these are push-ups, but they kind of go into something else here. He's going to do a dolphin kick in a second. It's pretty crazy. Right? This is how I like to do my push-ups. I don't know about you. Actually, this is probably more like how I do my push-ups. Anyway, okay. Um, Doubts are like push-ups. nobody, I mean, these guys, some of these guys seem like they do it for the sheer joy of it, but you're not normal if you do push-ups for the sheer joy of doing push-ups. They're kind of painful. They're quite unpleasant in some ways. But notice push-ups have tremendous benefits, right? They push-ups have value, but it's not value in themselves. It's value, as we say in philosophy, value as a means. As a kind of extrinsic value. It's value in what you get as a result. And for push-ups, you get strength, health, those kind of things. What do you get with doubt? Well, I think what doubts end up being for us are warning lights that there's some tension in our beliefs that we need to address. You know what I mean? If your dash looks like that, if your car has that many lights on, like it's time to do something about that. You ignore that stuff to your great peril. We want to have these warning lights that blink on when we've experienced doubt. Here's what it's time to do. It's time to lean in. It's time to pursue. It's time to ask those questions that have maybe been in the back of our minds for a very, very long time. Now, I think that there's a really strong biblical reason why we will experience doubts. I think why this is normal. And it's because our relationship to the world, our relationship to God is one that, in terms of our knowledge, is one that is partial. Does that make sense? So we see in part, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 13:12, one of my favorite verses in the Bible, and he describes us as seeing in a mirror dimly, right? Now, for in the first century, some of your Bible translations will say see through a glass darkly, see through it. It's not really what the passage says, but when we talk of mirrors, it's hard for us because we typically think of a very clear mirror. But just think in the first century, in seeing a reflection, it would be necessarily obscure, similar to the mirror on the screen, right? And you would only have a partial picture. That's what Paul is saying. And he goes on to say, hey, there will be a day in which we will see in full, we will know in full, and we will, by the way, be fully known. That's why I love the passage, such a beautiful picture of what's going to be one day. But right now, we see in a mirror dimly. That's just our perspective on the world. It's a partial one. So, of course, we're going to experience questions. We're going to have questions. And of course, in those questions, we are going to experience some doubts. That's just how the Bible describes our perspective that way. All right. Now, I've got a few minutes here before we take a little break. And then we'll have a second session where I lay out 7 strategies for how to do this. So trying to get real practical, which, as a philosophy guy, I don't always get very practical, but we're going to get real practical in this. So, but before we do that, what I want to do is illustrate what it would be like to stumble on an objection where we need to ask a deep and difficult question and lean in and see where we end up. Okay. Let's say that we all, I guess I don't want to presume, but I believe that Scripture is true and trustworthy. Let's say that we believe that Scripture is true and trustworthy. But here it comes, right? You're reading along, or you're reading some Bart Ehrman. I don't know if you know who that is, but he's a New Testament critic. Doesn't believe that the Bible is true or trustworthy. He thinks there's lots of contradictions in the Bible. So you're reading some Bart Ehrman, and he points out the fact that the empty tomb narratives, right, where Jesus' tomb is found empty by women followers, every one of the Gospels has a different list of women, every single one of them. So Matthew says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. Mark says Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome came to came to the tomb when the sun had risen, not came to work. Luke, of course, Dr. Luke is the most exhaustive. He says, now there were Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and also the other women with them, just to cover all of his bases. And John only mentions Mary Magdalene, right? So It doesn't say she came alone. It just says that Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb. So this is all referencing the very same event. You have four different accounts with four different lists of women. Bart Ehrman thinks this is a prime example of a contradiction in Scripture. And so we need to ask this deep and difficult question whether or not the Bible does, in fact, contradict right here. You can imagine, right? If you've never seen this before and you're reading along, maybe you're young in the faith, or maybe you've been a Christian for a long, long time and never noticed how, can I say it this way, how out of step each one of these accounts are, or at least they might look out of step in some ways. And you can imagine someone really deeply struggling with their belief that Scripture is true and trustworthy. When you look at this, you might think, uh-oh, it looks like it's got a contradiction, perhaps. All right, so what do you want to do? What do you notice about all four of these lists in order to try to address what would perhaps be this doubt or this struggle? What do you think?
One thing you notice is that none of them say that.
Right. That'd be a problem. That'd be a straight contradiction. Yeah. Good. What else do you notice? Who shows up in every one? Mary Magdalene, right? So we see that she's mentioned first in every account. Now, and again, that was an excellent point to say that if it said Mary Magdalene came by herself, now we've got a contradiction because we have some accounts that say she came with other women, and if John said she came by herself, but it doesn't actually say that. It just says that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, right? Now, what's going on here? So, in order to illustrate this, somebody give me a famous person. Who comes to mind as a famous person? Donald Trump. Okay. Last night was our first event. Also, Donald Trump was the first person that came to mind there. Okay. Imagine Donald Trump is stopping by my office, right? I've got office hours. Maybe he's got philosophical questions. I don't know. He's coming, but the president doesn't travel alone, of course. The president's going to travel with his security detail. And so he's got just two for this quick event, just going to run in quick. So he's going to come up to my office. He's got his security guys, Joe and Bob. So it's Donald Trump, Joe, and Bob are coming to my office. So they come in, we have a nice conversation. I don't know what Donald Trump would be asking philosophical questions, but anyway, let's just leave that aside. We have a nice conversation, they leave. I walk out of my office. What would I likely say? Donald Trump just came to my office, right? I wouldn't necessarily say Donald Trump and these other two that you've never heard of, Joe and Bob, came to my office. But I could be talking to someone later who's a huge Donald Trump fan, let's say, and wants to know every single detail about this visit with Donald Trump. And what I maybe say, even just minutes later, I could say Donald Trump, Joe, and Bob, and give a much longer list of women, and I'm sorry, not of women, of people, and notice that's completely consistent. Have I contradicted myself at all? No, right? Because if Donald Trump, Joe, and Bob came to my office, it follows that Donald Trump came to my office. Those are consistent, and depending what our purposes would be, John, of course, being the latest of the Gospels, maybe Mary Magdalene is the only famous person of those lists that people would remember. So same way, John might not have had the purpose to mention everyone that came. The way Dr. Luke, again, being quite exhaustive typically, maybe would, right? So we have a completely consistent account. Now, here's what gets really cool. So no contradiction at all. But here's what gets really cool, is that let's say we had four accounts and they were identical, the exact same accounts. If we had four identical accounts, how many eyewitness accounts do we suddenly have? Just one. That's been repeated 4 times, because clearly if it's identical, then it's just the same story. It's the same source. But the fact that we have 4 that differ in terms of its details, means that we have four independent accounts. We actually go from having just one account, which would be great, it would be good, to having four accounts, which is amazing. And you ask anybody, in fact, I don't know if you know the name J. Warner Wallace, who's a friend of mine. I've heard him speak on this many times. And this was a big thing for him. He was a cold case detective, or it still is in some ways. This was a big thing for him as he was reading through the Gospels. He looked at these alleged contradictions, and given the fact that he's been interviewing people for his career, and you get all kinds of differences of details that almost sound like two different stories, two different events. But when you can put them together and have this beautiful sort of, fuller, richer view of what in fact happens. So four accounts, four eyewitness accounts is amazing in terms of the probability of the account being true. So notice what we did. We asked a question, we leaned in, and we come out the other side of it with knowledge, right? With arguably a greater confidence. Because let's say that's the first time somebody heard that and they were struggling with it, but then they made their way clear through it. Next time a question comes up like that, what are they going to have? They're going to have greater confidence, right? So what I say is that doubt, when handled properly, leads to more reasonable belief. I just really think it does. When we lean in and we investigate, we find more reasonable belief, and as a result, a greater confidence. So doubts lead to truth and a greater faith. I think that's a pretty powerful thing. That's again my story, is that as I'm doubting my faith in this seminary classroom, and I've watched people do this where they've doubted their faith, and because they're doubting their faith, they walk away. Like they walk away right there. And I just think that's, for me, that wouldn't have been responsible, because I didn't suddenly know Christianity was true for sure, but I also didn't know it was false. So it's like, why would I walk away at that point? What I did is I leaned in and I found lots of answers. I found that Christianity actually holds up to life's biggest questions. I found my faith growing as I made my way clear. And I'm not saying I got everything figured out, because I stand here today still asking questions, because I see through a mirror dimly. Right? I still have partial knowledge. So of course I don't have it all figured out, but I've got a lot figured out. I've got a lot of my questions answered along the way, at least, with reasonable sorts of questions that still are being worked on to some degree. But that's how I found my way through. Now, just to sort of close off this first talk, I'm really convinced that what we need to do in order to not walk away, what we need to be aiming at, is seeing that Christianity is true, for sure, right? That's part of the picture, and that's what apologetics really focuses on a lot. But I think we need to do better than that, actually, because you can believe something's true and just not care about it, right? How many of us know that we need to eat healthy food, right? We know that. Do we do it? We all know it, or do we all know, we're all convinced that it's true that we ought to exercise regularly, but some of us just, yeah, I mean, some people care about it. I guess I care about it, but right, sometimes I hope to, but there's a lot of people that just don't exercise, even though they know it's true. It's really when you come before something and you realize, man, this isn't just true, but this is good. This is beautiful. This is, in philosophy, we call these the transcendentals. And what you do when you find something that's true, good, and beautiful, you pursue it with all that you have, right? With all of your heart. And I'm really convinced that what I came to see in my journey is that Christianity is true, but it's not just true. It's also good. It's a good force in the world. It transforms lives. And it's also beautiful. It's the right, the most beautiful story. J.R.R. Tolkien has a great quote, right? I've got some Lord of the Rings stuff coming in a minute, but anyway, right, he's got a great quote about seeing it as the ultimate story, um, that we long for it to be true. It's that good. It's that beautiful. For when we're convinced it's true, good, and beautiful, right? We might still have questions and we might still even have doubts, but we're not going to jump ship just because we do.